Hi, everyone. How are y'all doing? Woo! Welcome to Config Day 2. It's been an awesome conference so far. My name is Ramilia Tai, and I will be your host for the next few hours. A little bit about me. I'm a brand designer on the Brand Studio team. Shout out to Brand Studio. I've been around since the very first config, and I recently worked on the dev mode launch video, as well as other dev mode branding moments. Super fun, super challenging because I'm not a developer. I like to tell people part of my job is pretending to be a product designer and/or developer. But what a ride it's been. Make some noise if you're super hyped about dev mode and all the new features that just dropped. Woo! Other than that, I'm a mom of four, Bay Area native, and washi tape collector. Okay, enough about me. Anyway, I'm so excited to be with you all and share all the amazing things we've been working on. Truly, you are in for a treat. We have an exciting lineup of some of my favorite Figmates. As you explore and make your way around config for day 2, we encourage you to share your adventure on social. Use hashtag config2023 on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Be Real, wherever you hang out on the interwebs. Cool, so let's get started. Welcome to the Deep Dives, where you get exclusive, in-person, only access to demos and sneak peeks of the newest release Figma features. I cannot wait to watch everyone's jaws drop over the next few hours. In the first 2 sessions, we'll be walking through all aspects of how to use variables in the context of design systems and variables. Jacob and Louis are going to be showing us how to use variables within the context of design systems, showing you how to equip your components with theming and dimensionality, as well as giving us a sneak peek into what's coming up next for variables. But first, let's take a look at this short video.
Something that can be like simple is not always simple at our scale. When you want to change some button spacing or you want to change iconography, we are affecting millions of lines of code, over 10 products.
Instead of having to maintain multiple components for different individual modes, Figma variables allow us to have that applied completely automatically.
Being able to literally just like right-click, mode equals dark or light, and just switch between. It's so hard to build the tooling to do that. Now it's just literally a fraction of a second.
You can switch between mobile to web without having to manually create different screens for different breakpoints. You save by not having to do things 5 times over.
And it also makes the handover process so much easier. What we're actually referencing now using Figma variables, an engineer can then see how it's realized in code.
You sort of have one source of truth from the design system of all the color tokens that doesn't get lost in translation.
One of the core principles at Spotify is ubiquity. Wherever you want to use Spotify, we want to be able to be there. That, of course, causes us to have design decisions at scale.
Customers pick up on the small differences between different platforms, and being able to deliver a consistent vision really helps this promote a unified customer experience. It introduces a lot of overhead for us to maintain all those complexities. Now we have the opportunity to really bridge the gap between all these platforms with the spacing tokens. There's a lot of potential to cut down all the libraries that we need to maintain.
We pretty much closed out a bunch of tickets because it solved a lot of the issues. Figma seems to listen to the community in a way that makes it seem like they're actually using their software themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to some variables fun. So excited to have you here today. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm a product manager over here at Figma, and I was very lucky enough to actually be the one running variables. Super excited for that. And with me today is the dashing.
I'm Louis, everybody. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm from London, and I'm a designer advocate. That basically means that this is kind of my job. I get to talk to all of you about components, styles, and now variables. Before we jump in, though, Jacob, quick bow tie check. Let's go.
We're good. All right, before we jump straight into variables, one of the things that I want to talk through is something Dylan was talking about yesterday, which is it is variables, not tokens. Design tokens have been a thing that we've really been getting asked for from the community for ages. And a bit about myself personally, one of the things that really motivated me to join Figma was I was just tired of waiting for design tokens. And so I was just like, you know what, I'm going to join them and go ahead and try and ship that. And let's jump into it a little bit more, though. As we were getting these requests for things such as design tokens, we are also getting other requests such as
string dictionaries,
or conditional logic, or
calculations and expressions,
or parametric design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had all of these things that were really interconnected and related. And really, if we built out a single solution for design tokens, we'd end up with disparate systems for all of these individual use cases. Instead of that, we wanted to build something more foundational, something that supported not only all of these use cases, but also that next big thing. And who knows what that'll be? That'll be driven by you, the community, and we're super excited to see that and how you use this foundational feature. Because that's really what variables is. It's a foundational feature that allows you to express all of these items as one feature. And so we're super excited to actually show off variables today, which is exactly that. It's a common foundation to build all of these things. And now I'm going to pass it off to Louis, who's going to jump us through the basics of variables.
Yeah, indeed. Before we jump in and start showing you how to create these things, how to use all the different types that we have, I think it's incredibly important to set these foundations for the foundation feature, the foundations for the foundational feature, if you will. We want to set this concrete base before we go and build our house, which is effectively the design systems that we want to go and support in the next coming years. I mentioned types. At launch, we'll be launching with 4 different types of variable. Color, pretty self-explanatory. You can use your color values in here. String variables for things like text. You can see these being applied in different language and translations and those kind of things in your systems. Number variables. As we saw yesterday, you can apply these in your height and width fields, also in min and max, and in any auto layout property. And Boolean, or if you want to pronounce it like Jolene from the song Jolene by Dolly Parton, feel free to go ahead. In V2, we'll also be supporting images and typography. So bear with us while we continue to turn the key on those ones, and they'll be coming before the end of the year. As for variables themselves, we bundle them in what we call a collection. So a collection is the overarching group of all of those different variables within our files. If we think about an example collection, maybe something like colors, you might have some semantic variables called something like text default, text success, text danger, et cetera, et cetera. These similar variables are what we'd intentionally group into that collection itself. You might have a collection for something like sizes to all those translation strings that I mentioned before. Within the collection, we have what are called modes. So if you think about our individual variables, text default again, the mode will contain the value for that variable. So if we take the text default example, the mode value might be 222, 222. Pretty straightforward. Where we can extend this, though, is by using multiple modes. So a mode contains the value for that variable, but many modes can contain variations of those variable values. And I'm starting to get into a little bit of mouth soup here, but stick with me. If we take the text default example from before, 222, 222, that might represent what we can commonly see as our day mode. If we want something like a night mode, however, the next mode will contain a variation of that that might have the string value of EEE for a light gray. So we end up with 2 modes in this situation. Text default translates into a darker color in day, a lighter color in the night mode. We've intentionally called these day and night mode in these versions because we have seen during our beta customer programs that when we prescribe light and dark mode, people think that that's exactly what they need to be called. But you can call these modes whatever you like. Day, night, German, French, Spanish, etc. Then we're going to move into something called aliases. And an alias is where you effectively reference variables across different collections. So if we take this text default example again, that is likely to be referencing a gray from our hex ramp. So we might have a gray 800, which feeds into text default. That means we're now not storing raw hex values inside of our currently styles, and we're powering these up with the variables that we're launching with. Those aliases can happen between the same collection, between multiple collections in the same file, or even between files if we want to. So don't feel like you're going to be constrained to that individual library file when you start to build out your variable collections. As it comes down to the types of token, we're trying to push for 3 main types. The first one is primitive. And this is effectively where you describe what the token looks like or what it effectively does before in a world of styles. So red 100, red 200, red 300 would be exactly that. They would be red. Alternative names for these, which we've seen in the wild, are things like base tokens, global tokens, atomic tokens. These are great, but we would really love it if we could try and push primitive as the name for that foundational layer in our variables. The next layer up is what we call semantic. This is where we start to reference those primitives into something that's way more descriptive and describes the intention of how you want to use that variable. So red 500, for example, may feed BG danger as an alias. So then we're introducing this multi-level approach to managing something that describes its intention and something that describes what it looks like. This is way more sophisticated, and if we decide at any point that BG danger needs to be referencing yellow 500, we can do that under the hood without having to change that semantic layer. Alternative names for these are alias tokens, brand tokens, or reference tokens. Alias tokens is a pretty common one, but again, we would love it if we could all align on calling these semantic layers, because what we look at as the alias is actually the reference between the variables, not the variable itself. Jacob's doing some very handy hand motions if you can't see what he's doing over here. The last layer is quite contentious, and this is the component layer. Jacob and I have actually had many a fight over this internally about whether we want to promote this as a practice. I personally love it. Jacob's not so sure. He believes it lives in the shadow root, which is a fair argument. The component token is where we go into a third layer. So if we take our button as an example, the button may get a variable called button BG. Totally optional. We may not need to go to that layer if we just rely on that semantic layer for BG action, for example. It can be useful if you have a really detailed, sophisticated system that relies on something like A/B testing at the component level. Or if you want to test out a new release of a specific component itself, you may rely on that component layer. But as I said, it's totally optional. OK, I've been talking a lot. Maybe let's have a look at how you actually create these things. We have a typical component here for a notification. It's a success state. And what we have here are 4 different properties that we have inside. We've got the radius, the border color, the foreground, and the background. I'm going to pull back my panels and deselect everything on the canvas. In the top right-hand corner, we now have a local variables option. And I can open up the variables panel by clicking on the little settings icon. From within here, you can see on the top left that we already have 3 collections inside this file. The first one, is my favorite icon, is the component one. The next one is our primitive colors, which has all of our very descriptive colors based off what they look like. And this is a color ramp from 1 to 500. And then we have something which we'll come back to in a moment. I'm now going to create a new collection in here called notification demo. I wouldn't recommend you call your collection demo, but for the purposes of today, we're going to run with this. Now what I'm going to do is sample these colors from the canvas. To create a variable, our empty state in the center provides me with a button to create that variable. And I have the 4 types that we're launching with. If I create my color, it's 1 second.
Love the live demos.
Nothing better. Can we see if yours is running?
Let's find out.
All right, we're going to switch over. Can we just make sure production's got the second screen, please? In the meantime, Jacob,
yes,
what's
sir.
been the hardest part about this project?
I think the interop between all of the features that it's supporting right now. So if you have, obviously, the design systems use case, that is obviously one of them. But we're using variables for so much more than that as well, including things like prototyping or that handoff for dev mode as well. That's been one of the biggest things for us personally.
Yeah. And your favorite part?
The mode switching. It's just magical. Seeing it drop and drag into things and just automatically adopt those contexts, it's so cool to see as a designer. And I don't know, for me, I think that's somewhere where we're going to be building in a bunch of really big improvements for it as well.
Yeah.
I'm excited for that.
Yeah, I can't wait for the teams to start using these things because we've been talking about this for a while.
Yeah.
And I know you're all really ready to go. Here we go. We're back on. Let's jump over. So let's just pretend that didn't happen. I'm going to open up my local variables panel on the right-hand side. Thank you. And to just delete these so we can start again. OK, we've got empty state of our variables panel. I'll create a variable for my color. And that's now activated that field. So now we can go and name this whatever we want. I'm going to use some colors just for the demo purposes today to make them extra descriptive so we can jump into them and reference them a little bit later. So first thing we're going to do is create a background. So BG notification. And now I can sample this using the picker on the canvas. The next one is our FG, so foreground notification. Again, nomenclature is something you can decide, but for the purposes of today, we're using BG, FG for reference. I'm going to zoom in here and sample this on the canvas. The last one I'm going to create for the colors is border. Border. And sample this too. The last one I'm also going to create here for the different type is I'm going to select my component on the canvas and see in the top right-hand side we have a number 48 for the radius, which is pretty round. So I'm going to create a number here for radius and write 48 inside. As I mentioned before, this could be aliased between collections, so if you need to go to that layer, you definitely can. Now with that component selected, I can apply them. Similar to how you would apply styles, scrolling down on the right-hand side, I now have my selection colors. And I can apply them from the panel here. So you see we've got FG notification, border, and BG notification. What you'll notice now is that these have switched to be a pill. So now we know that we're supplying these, feeding these with variables, instead of them being raw hex values or styles previously. Lastly, in the radius panel at the top right, we now, if I hover on here, you'll see we get a variables icon, which you'll start to see feeding throughout the entire product now. Selecting this, I now have the radius property in my dropdown, and I can apply it. This also gets fed with that pill shape that should be now quite familiar. Nothing has changed visually here, but under the hood, we now know that we're feeding this with those local variables in this file. Back to Jacob.
Alrighty, I want to talk through, obviously, one of my favorite things in here is modes. And modes is an awesome superpower that variables has. Obviously, we can do simple things with this, such as we can do light and dark mode made easy. And here we can just simply drag this over and inherit this context. And we can see that update immediately. Oh, and can we switch screens over to mine? Let's see. Are you presenting it?
Let's just drive from here.
Let's drive from there. Yep. Easy enough. And so modes are really one of the superpowers that we have over here. One of the things that we can do with them is obviously this dragging, and that's really supported by going forward and creating semantic references between light and dark mode. For example, we can have over here, as Lou was showing, things like text, background, or border, things that are describing how you use these variables and representing them across multiple modes. To bring it down to the real world, I want to create an actual example over here today. Louis, would you step one step to the left? Now, some people have been saying online that Louis was stealing my confit, and they may have a point. I personally would argue that it's just a different mode representation of it. And that's dope. I'm down with that.
Thank you for entertaining us.
Absolutely. But before we go in and see how we actually create this, let's look one more time at the old way that we went forward to actually create variables without, or do theming without variables. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to try and use your keyboard from another country. How do I hide the UI? Thank you. How do we get the UI back? Bless you. All right, let's look at this label over here. Previously, what I have to do is I'd have to select this. I'd have to go ahead and create a component over here. Then from there, I'd create a variant of that, name that a dark variant. Then in that dark variant, I'd go through down to the selection colors, change the fill to a lighter color like this, change the actual text over here to a darker color. Then I'd go ahead and add a colorblind mode and a different mode for high contrast. And then I'd do this over and over again for all the different components inside of my system, over and over and over and over until I was maintaining hundreds of thousands of variants.
Which sounds fun.
Is it? That does not sound fun at all.
Anybody else had that amount of fun before in Figma?
An absolute pain. But now one of the things that we can do is we can represent this exact same component across multiple different modes. So you're now only having to update a single source of truth. And that is really the power of variables. Going forward even further, I want to show you how we can do that utilizing the notification example that Louis was showing us previously. And so let's look into this really quick. Over here, I'm going to select this notification example. And what we can already see is that it is equipped with our BG notification, our border, and our foreground notification. But I want to go ahead and set up that collection that Louis had set up earlier to enable multiple modes. So the first thing I'm going to do over here is open up my local variables authoring window. And then in here, I'm going to go and add a new mode. Once I do this, immediately what we're seeing is that we have mode 1 and mode 2. I'm going to simply rename these to be my light mode and my dark mode. And then from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my dark mode references to the color palette that we have over here. So I'm going to change my BG for dark over to this background. I'm just going to sample that. And then for my foreground over here, I'm going to sample this one. And then likewise for my border, I'm going to go ahead and sample that one as well. And now here's one of the fun things. Once I do that, we'll notice that I can go over here into the layer panel, and I can click on this, and I can switch this into dark mode. And we immediately see a different representation of this notification component. In addition to that, though, what we also have in the layer panel is a description showing you that this has been explicitly set to dark mode. That way you can understand what the context of this layer is, but you can also understand what layers underneath it are inheriting. But I'm going to go a bit further than that as well. I want to show off a pro tip over here from Louis, first of all.
So that pill that he just showed you for the variable switcher that appears in the layers and it appears in the properties panel only appears if you have a variable that has multiple modes applied. So think of that as like a, hey, this is happening as well. That also enables us to unlock something else, which is an auto mode, which Jacob's going to run through now.
Absolutely. Auto is one of the really cool things inside of variables. If we actually look over here in this drop-down for the layer panel, we'll see that this selection here has 3 options: auto, light, and dark. But if we go back to the actual authoring modal over here, one of the things that we'll notice is that I've only set up 2 modes. That third one, auto, is a special one. And what it means is look through my parent lineage, and if there's any explicitly set mode, automatically inherit that and apply it to myself. So let's see that in action. I'm going to go ahead and expand this over here. And what we're going to see is we have a few different options over here as well. I'm just going to move this over here. And I'm going to set up some context for each of the elements that we have over here. Right now, I have a light mode and a dark mode frame set up. I'm going to go ahead and just bind each of these to have my foreground color over here. And I'm also going to steal internet from Louis over here so I can get it on this laptop. Fingers crossed. Allow accessory to connect. Let's find out. Libraries.
Smooth like butter.
Smooth like butter. I love seeing it. Nada. Oh, there we go. We saw some. Look at that. And thank you for the notification that there was no internet on this laptop, Louis. Very kind of you.
Just looking out for you, Jacob.
Now. And so I'm going to go ahead and set this fill over here to inside of the library. Oh, we got some things happening. I'm going to set this to my foreground, and then I'm going to set this one over here also to my foreground. And you're going to see why in a second. So now what I can do, now that I've applied these variables inside of this frame, at the parent frame level, I can go ahead with this layer and now explicitly set this to light mode. And likewise with this one over here, I can explicitly set this to dark mode.
And you would have noticed the dark mode text changed color there too.
Magic. And now what we're going to do is, with this notification example, I'm going to set this back to auto. And once I've done that, now what I can do is I can drag this notification over here into light mode. And we'll notice nothing changes there because I'm going from light mode into light mode. But as soon as I drag this into dark mode, we'll notice that automatically changes and inherits that update. It took us a little while to get there, but we got there.
You got there. That was auto.
That was auto. And now I'm going to pass it back to Louis on this laptop, where he's going to walk through some numbers. Take it away, Louis.
Thank you. So let's go and take a look at a few more different variable types. And I'm going to start with numbers, and I'll run through Booleans as well. Numbers, just like the general variable token itself, has a few different types of applications that we can put it inside. So height and width, as I mentioned before, as well as that min and max that we are really thankful that are shipped as well. Border radius, as I showed you before, as well as all the auto layout properties, so space between and padding around your elements. Number types will also be fed into typography once we ship that, as well as shadows and layout grids. So eventually, we're going to be having variables for numbers almost everywhere inside the product. Similar as well to the general variables, different types that I mentioned at the start, we align with those for our numbers as well. The primitive number type would be something like size 4, where you'd expect that to be something like 4 pixels in size. Feeding that into our semantic layer, something like radius small, you might be feeding that with size 12 for a 12 radius. And then lastly, again, the component layer, which is definitely optional, but I would like you to think about it, is that you might have something like a title margin bottom. I've kept these names intentionally vague to show you that they're definitely not something you should be thinking about, but maybe you should. You might have a toast padding horizontal, something like that. In practice, we typically find ourselves building components that look something like this, where we have what is everybody's favorite component, the button, in a few different states, default, hover, inactive, and a few different densities: compact, comfortable, spacious. At the moment, this is fine. We can add as many different variants as we need until performance starts to hit and we pull our hair out. What we can start to think about is how we can look at this in a much larger scale across our system, where we might have, and definitely do have, more than just one button. In this instance where we have 3 buttons, we've now got 27 components that are really, really similar. And that just is not efficient. That's just not how we want to be running our systems. So what we want to start thinking about is how can we consolidate these things using those number variables that I mentioned. If we zoom in and look at our densities now, we've got that compact, comfortable, and spacious set up in the file already. I'm going to create another collection in here, suitably named button demo. Now what I'm going to do is just take a look at the properties we have inside this button. If I select the compact in here, you can see we've got a 12 radius, 12 horizontal padding, 4 vertical. If I look at the last one, the spacious one, we've got 100, which is effectively all round. Then we've got a 24 horizontal and a 12 vertical. Let's maybe think about how we can supply these with number variables. Just create those number variables. I'll create one for radius. I'll set the default value for this to be 100 to match what we have selected. I'll create another number variable for horizontal padding. Just like before, these names are to be confirmed. This one will be 24, and then we'll have a vertical one too. Spelled correctly. This is set to 12. So let's go and apply these. Similar to before, in the radius input on the top right, I can now apply my radius from this collection, swap to the pill, everything's cool. Next up, we've got the auto layout. We've got our horizontal padding. And we've got our vertical padding here. So I've now applied that to all 3 of those components. Imagine this in your system, where you could select infinite amounts of components that have the same values and apply them all in batch like that. Back to what Jacob mentioned before, we can have multiple modes inside of here. So now we can think about these effectively modes for our densities and apply the variables for those as well. In this top level mode, I have my spacious. The next one I have my comfortable. And lastly, we have compact. For the comfortable ones, let's select them. We've got 16 on the radius. We have 16 horizontal. And we have 8 on the comfortable, on the vertical. For the last one, we want to look at our compact. So this one, we have 12 on the radius, 12 horizontal, and 4 vertical. Let's now apply those two. Bump that down. We've got radius, we've got horizontal, and we've got vertical. And you're probably thinking, wait a second, they're changing. They look exactly like this last one. Bear with me a second. Let's now finally apply those to the center. The radius, horizontal, horizontal, and vertical. If I take an instance now, we still have that variant switcher over here for density. But we can totally remove this, because what we can now rely on is that mode inheritance. So if I scroll down in the right panel to my layer section, that variable icon has popped up again, and I can change the variable mode from here. So I've got my collection. Auto is spacious, because that's the first mode that we have in the collection. I can change it to comfortable, and I can change it to compact. So what we can now do is just delete all of these, reducing our pretty limited set of 9 components down to 3. And at scale, we've gone from 27 down to 9. Across the entire system of real-world components, and hundreds of them, you can imagine the consolidation, you can imagine the performance improvements, and you can imagine the usability improvements from trying to find a component in a system from things that look pretty similar. Next up is sizes. So I've touched just loosely on sizes here, but we're going to create some more variables and use an example from us, which is the Auto Layout Launch RCS modal. This is something that we launch and usually have in desktop and mobile, which in the current state means supporting effectively 2 versions of the same component. Again, inefficient. We should be able to consolidate these down to 1 component. So let's go and do that. Similar to before, open up my variables panel, create a new collection, and call this card demo. And then have a look at our layer structure. For any of you that know me, you know that I love layers and how to structure them. So there's quite a few in here, and they're all named. Very important. Here, what we have is a wrapper for our content. So our content is wrapped at the bottom here. We have our artwork at the top, and we have our copy, and then the button at the bottom. We can now apply some values to make this look a little prettier by navigating back up to the layer tree, Shift and Enter, and starting to look at the values that we want to apply to this card. Let's create a new variable for number and call this radius. And I'm going to start with 12 here. Then we're going to start thinking about our content. So within here, I don't know, let's pad this out by 16. Number variable, I'm going to call this space between just to match what the terminology is with auto layout. I would encourage you to use a sizing variable for this. But again, for today, we're going to run with this one. I'll set this to 16. Then create a padding variable. And I'll set this to 16 too. Selecting my component, I'm going to apply the radius again. Come back to my card demo collection. You'll see the collections are split by the bold labels. So if you have a ton of collections in your file, that's how you'll be able to distinguish between them. If you split your collections up between files, you can also manage permissions between who gets access to what collections as well. That may end up in a world where your primitives, red 100, live in a collection that people don't see. So you can start to split up the privileges and who gets access to the right tokens and the right variables wherever they need them. Let's apply that radius. Starting to come into shape already, a nice 12 radius. Let's apply some spacing to our content for the padding. Coming together. And maybe the space between as well. For the auto layout space between variable, you notice this is slightly different. We drop open the panel within that field, and we can apply a variable at the bottom here, and apply our space between. Lastly, I'll select my button, jump back to the parent, and apply our padding here as well. This is fill container, so there'll be no horizontal difference. You can start to see that's coming together. Maybe it's a little chunky, but I'm OK with that. And we've got a radius at the end as well. The last one I want to do, because I mentioned at the start that this is a desktop and a mobile component. So let's now create another variable for a number for the width. And I'm going to set this width to be 360 and change the mode to be mobile. Over to the right-hand side, I now have 2 panels, which I'm going to drag an instance into. And this is where we can start to rely on mode inheritance again to think about that desktop and mobile option. This is an instance component, so it's inheriting all of those variables straight from the top. But if we take an option and pull it to the right-hand side and want the desktop version right now, either we'd have to manually resize this or ship another component as a variant or a separate component itself. Again, inefficient, inefficient, inefficient. Let's pull open the variables panel, create another mode called desktop. And now I'm going to select the parent here. So this is the top-down option for how you can inherit those modes. Select my layers panel, card demo, desktop. No change because we haven't changed the values yet. Let's now make some changes in here. So I'll zoom in a little bit, change the radius to be 24. You can see that rounding up already. Space between, let's match that, 24. And padding, let's go big. Let's go 48. Lastly, because this is desktop, we probably want something to be slightly wider. Let's set the width to be 480. And now I just need to apply that. So if I head back to the main component, in the width field, we drop this down, apply the variable, width, and you see that automatically applied in the desktop version. So we're managing all those values in one collection here for our card component, and that propagates to every single instance that we have wherever we're using it. Consolidating components, introducing those variables. Next up is Booleans. So this is something that actually applies really well. This one works incredibly well in tandem with prototyping, but it does have some real big impact to our design systems too. Again, historically, if we're looking at something like a menu, we've got a black menu here for the contrast on the screen. Desktop version, mobile version, you might have a tablet version, you might have a different version for different platforms. They will all either be different variants or different components themselves. Again, let's consolidate those down and try to work out how we can have one component for many different instances. So the before and the after are drastically different. Right now, the after has everything inside, which would probably match how we'd structure the HTML. What we want to be doing is just looking at our display none, display visible to show the elements within this menu rather than having somebody ship in a different component and confusing our engineers. Let's open up the variables panel and create another collection called menu demo. And within here, I'm going to start creating some Boolean options. So within this menu, we have the mobile hamburger, the logo, the menu items for desktop, and the basket or cart icon for mobile. The first variable we'll create is that Boolean option at the bottom. I'm just going to call this hamburger. And I'm going to set this to false. If this is working on the assumption that we want desktop to be the default option, it'll be the other way around if you want your mobile menu to be the first one. The next variable, Boolean as well, will be menu items. I'm going to set this to true, because you want on desktop those menu items to display. And lastly, we're going to have the basket icon set to false too, rename the mode to desktop, and start to apply these. If I drill down into the layers, I've got my hamburger selected. And to apply the Boolean variable, still in the same position in the layers panel, there's an eye icon, which you may never have paid attention to. But if you right-click on it, we can now apply those Boolean options. You'll now see all those Boolean variables appearing in that drop-down list. And I can go and apply the hamburger that automatically hides it from the canvas. In the layers panel, you'll see the visibility is now switched to off. And we have the hamburger Boolean applied in the right-hand side in the properties panel. For the other options too, select my menu items, right-click, apply my menu items. No visible change. We want those to be on. Lastly, select the basket icon, right-click, toggle off. We now have our desktop menu. A new mode will be created where we go for mobile. We basically want to reverse all of these. So we want on and off for different platforms. On, off, on. Now taking instance of that component, I can again use the toggle for that inheritance, menu demo, auto desktop, again, because that's the first mode in the collection. Change it to mobile. We switch them out. We get our mobile items, and we get the desktop items in the desktop version. But because I'm very particular about sizes, I know that I want my desktop menu to be 1440 and my mobile menu to be 375. So let's bring back the number variable for width. I'll set my desktop to 1440, my mobile to 375, select them both, and now apply that width. Apply it to both. Mobile switches to 375. We've now got our same component being powered by the Booleans. All right, back to Jacob to wrap up.
Alrighty, y'all. Obviously, so excited to show all of this here today. But in addition to that, one of the things that we want to do for all of you is to talk a little bit about what's coming next for variables. One of the things that we're deeply aware of over here is that you are depending on us to build out your roadmaps and to architect your design systems. So we want to give you a little sneak peek about what we're working on and what's coming next for this feature. One of the first things is obviously typography support. This is a huge one, and we're totally aware that we need this for a true multi-product, multi-brand experience. Trust us when we say that we are working on this really hard, and we're trying to get this out before the end of the year. One of the next things that we're looking at doing as well is equipping all of the other elements inside of Figma to allow you to bind variables to them. Some highlights here are effects, so you can apply to things such as the effect color or the blur, or layer opacity, and also binding to individual gradient stops. That's really what we want to allow variables to do, is to allow you to bind to literally anywhere inside of Figma that you want to control with the variable. The next thing is we're going to make this work hand in hand with component properties. So you can then bind a variable to a component property and use that to dynamically control your components. One of the other elements that I want to talk through, though, is the next big thing, which is really the biggest superpower of variables. And that's going to be something known as extended collections. Extended collections is going to be one of our answers for solving this multi-product, multi-brand approach for variables. I'm going to walk you through today a little bit of how it works. First and foremost, oftentimes when we're designing these modes, we have two axes. One is our brands. For example, we may have a base brand. We may have a sheets brand as well. But in addition to that, we also have things such as light and dark mode. How we represent this today, however, is a little bit difficult because we have to have a sequence of all of these inside of our mode. For example, we'll have our base light, our base dark, and then our sheets light and our sheets dark. And this becomes a problem as we go to a larger scale where we have many products, such as if we have a ton of things inside of our system, suddenly we have this exponential growth of modes. And so what we want to do instead is allow you to go ahead and define your base color system, where we just have things such as your default BG and default text, as well as your brand BG and brand text, and then create another collection that's an extension of that, where you can add your overrides only to the elements that you want to override, such as the brand BG or the brand text. And then what we can do is we can create this inheritance pattern, so some of these elements will be inherited, while other elements will be overridden. And the great thing about that is then what we can do is we can use that hand in hand with your core design system, and it'll allow you to go ahead and switch some of these components between one brand or another. And so that's one of the superpowers that we think we're going to give you with extended collections. But we've got a little bit of time left. Louis?
And we took a look at Twitter, as we do, and saw there's a ton of questions coming in. We weren't editing this backstage. So we took a few questions, and we're going to try and answer them live for you. First one, Jacob. What's the difference between styles and variables?
It's a great question. Styles are something that we're looking at for a group of values. For example, a style today for a fill can often incorporate things such as a backing image, as well as a gradient on top of that, all with layer modes applied to each of them. With variables, we're looking to represent one and only one value. And so that's really the biggest difference between these things. If we compare this a little bit to the web, one of the ways to think about it is a style can be something that is analogous to a CSS class, whereas a variable is a single CSS variable. And so they play hand in hand, and you can back those styles with variables as well. Next question, what do we got? Oh, are you deprecating styles? Louis, I'm going to toss this to you.
Absolutely not. Styles are still very important to us and will be continue to be supported. Variables are different. And effectively what you want to do is work with what works for your team. If you need styles, use styles. If you need variables, use variables. They will also work pretty well in tandem with each other. So keep doing what you're doing now, and we'll continue to support you as you go forward. Next question. Why can't I use a full stop or a period in the variable name?
It's a great question. One of the things we're aiming to do with this is to align as close as possible to the W3C community token spec. Right now, in variable names, periods are not allowed in them per the spec. However, one thing we're looking at doing in the future is allowing you to separate out what name you have in Figma from the code syntax representation of this token. And one of the things we'll be trying to do is pushing that out so you can customize that yourselves. Once we do that, we'll have a little bit more flexibility, but for now, we really want to align with that spec as much as possible.
I am looking forward to designer-friendly names and developer-friendly names.
I'm so excited for that. All right, next question. How do I import an expert, Louis?
Thankfully, a couple of people on my team, Jake and Akbar, built a couple of plugins for us. So these are something you can run. They're stored on GitHub. You can run them locally in your organization, and you can then import and export your JSON files as you need to run the variables that we just launched. So we have plugins. You can use them. Please go ahead and give us feedback as well if they're not suitable for what you need. We're looking to publish more updates to these in the future. Now you're all ready to go. Before you do that, we've also prepared a variables playground file, which you can go and find in the Figma community. Go and search variables playground. There's a ton of other examples in there to get you up to speed with the 4 different types of variable that we have supported at launch. As well, that will be updated as we continue to ship updates. As well as that, we'll have another live stream on July 29th where we'll be focusing specifically on migration. So make sure you go and sign up to that on our events page, and we'll see you all there. Thank you so much. This has been fun. Enjoy the rest of your conference.